Dust rose in slow spirals as the wagon limped along the edge of the desert road. The sun hung low, swollen and red, its dying light spilling across the land like a wound that refused to close. Inside the wagon sat a woman with eyes the color of storm water, tired, hollow, but not yet defeated. Her name was never spoken aloud that day, not by her or the world around her. Some names were too small to matter out here, where mercy was a rumor and kindness a luxury. Beside her lay her mother, pale as bone and burning with fever. Each breath was a quiet war between life and surrender. And near the woman's knee, clinging to the hem of her skirt, sat a little girl with braids tangled by wind and dust, clutching a rag doll whose face had long since faded away. They had been traveling for days, maybe weeks. It was hard to tell, when every sunrise looked the same. Once, there had been a man driving this wagon. He had built it, painted it, promised that it would carry them to a better life. But death in the frontier was fast and without ceremony. A cough, a night, a silence. Then only the women remained. The horses were gone too, traded for medicine that never worked. The wagon moved, now, only when the woman pushed or the wind helped. By dusk, the town appeared like a mirage, small, wooden, half asleep. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the faint sound of laughter came from the saloon, a laughter that had forgotten decency. The woman lifted her mother from the wagon, her hands trembling from exhaustion. The old woman murmured nonsense, words caught between dreams and fever. The little girl tugged her mother's sleeve. "Mama, she's getting cold," she said softly. Her voice was brittle, like glass ready to break. The woman carried her mother to the porch of the general store, hoping for water, maybe a kind face. But the shopkeeper only frowned. He looked at her as though poverty were contagious. "No handouts," he muttered and shut the door before she could answer. She went to the next place, then the next. A widow, a sick old woman, and a child. There was no fortune in helping them. As the sky deepened into purple, the woman's hope drained away. She led her family behind the livery stable, where the wind couldn't reach. There, among the straw and shadows, she laid her mother down and covered her with an old blanket. The girl huddled close, whispering that tomorrow they'd find a doctor, a miracle, something. The woman stroked her daughter's hair and nodded even though she didn't believe it. Then she looked out toward the silent town and whispered a prayer, not for herself, but for anyone, to listen. The night grew colder. Coyotes sang in the distance. The girl woke often, frightened by every sound. When dawn began to gray the horizon, she slipped from her mother's side. Barefoot, she walked through the empty streets, her small hand dragging the doll by its arm. Her voice was small, but steady as she called out to the only people she could see. "Please, someone help. They hurt my mom. She is sick." Her words were strange, confused. A child's way of saying the world had been cruel to them. Men on porches stared at her, some pitying, others annoyed. No one moved. A saloon door swung open, releasing a rush of laughter and whiskey air. The girl's voice reached inside. "Please, my mama is sick." The laughter stopped. From the shadows within, a man turned his head. He was taller than most, built broad and heavy, with eyes that had learned to see too much. They called him the giant rancher, half out of respect, half out of fear. His hands could break a horse's will. His silence could quiet a room. He had long ago stopped listening to the world, but something in the child's voice, something raw and trembling, split through the hard shell of his indifference. He stepped into the street. The girl looked up, dirt streaked across her cheeks. She clutched her doll tighter, but didn't back away. "They hurt my mom," she said again, as if the words themselves might summon help. He knelt, the dust curling around his boots, and asked in a voice low as thunder, "Where is she?" She pointed toward the stable, toward the edge of town where the wind was carrying her mother's shallow breaths into the morning. He stood, the boards beneath him creaking under his weight, and for the first time in years, something moved behind his eyes that wasn't anger or grief. It was recognition. The girl followed him as he walked. People watched from windows, whispering that the rancher had gone mad or soft. But he didn't care. His life had been made of fences and silence, Maybe this was the first thing worth breaking both for. When they reached the stable, the light was dim, the air thick with the scent of hay and despair. The woman lay curled around her mother, both motionless but not yet gone. She looked up as the shadow of the rancher fell across the doorway. For a heartbeat, fear flashed in her eyes. Fear of another man come to take what little remained. But then she saw the child standing beside him, holding his hand. He didn't speak. He just took off his hat, kneeling beside the older woman, his rough hands hovering uncertainly before touching her forehead. The heat of her fever startled him. He turned to the widow and said quietly, "You need water." She nodded, unable to speak. Her throat burned with exhaustion, gratitude, disbelief. The child ran to fetch the bucket as if her small body had finally found purpose. When the water touched her mother's lips, the woman exhaled a tremor of relief. The rancher sat back on his heels, studying the scene with a heaviness that didn't belong to strangers. He had known sickness before, known loss too well. The girl clung to his arm, whispering, "You came." He almost smiled, but the weight of memory kept it small. By the time the sun rose fully, the stable was warm with the scent of life returning. The old woman's breathing steadied. The widow's eyes no longer darted like a cornered animal's. Outside, the town continued its indifferent mourning, unaware that something quiet and miraculous had begun. The rancher stood to leave, but the girl grabbed his coat. "Don't go yet," she said. He looked down at her, at the tiny hand clutching worn fabric, at the faith shining through her dirt-streaked face, and for the first time in a long while he didn't. He stayed. The woman watched him from where she knelt, the lines of her face softening in the glow of morning. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of fear and fatigue, something flickered, something she thought had died along with hope. It wasn't love, not yet. It was simply this, the feeling that maybe, after all the cruelty of the trail, someone had finally stopped walking away. The morning after he stayed, the rancher came again, this time with a mule and 2 buckets of water. The town still whispered behind his back, but he paid them no mind. He had seen judgment before. It had lost its teeth long ago. The widow was kneeling by her mother, her hair coming undone, her eyes sunken yet determined. The fever had broken some time before dawn, leaving the old woman weak, but breathing steady. When the rancher stepped through the stable door, the child ran to him, barefoot, her joy unshaken by the world's coldness. He handed her a small loaf of bread, wrapped in cloth. "For your mother," he said simply. The girl nodded, though she tore a piece for herself with the solemnity of someone who had learned to share hunger. The woman tried to speak, to thank him, but her voice faltered. Gratitude felt too heavy to put into words. She had spent too long asking for mercy for men who gave none. He knelt again by her mother, touching the damp cloth on her forehead. "She'll need broth," he murmured, "and rest." His voice was rough, shaped by silence and wind. "I don't have either," the widow whispered, half ashamed, half defiant. He studied her face, the stubbornness there. "You will," he said, then turned to leave. Before the door closed, he added softly, "I'll bring what you need." That afternoon, he returned with blankets, a pot of stew, and a canteen. He said nothing about payment. The widow tried to protest, but he only looked at her, steady, unyielding. It wasn't charity he was offering. It was something older, something closer to decency. Days stretched into a rhythm of quiet exchanges. The rancher brought supplies, mended the stable roof, and checked the fever's return. The little girl followed him everywhere, asking questions that cracked through his walls like light through old wood. She called him Mr. Giant, and he didn't correct her. Sometimes, when she laughed, he felt a strange warmth crawl into his chest, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. The widow watched him from the corner of her eye. He worked with care, not haste. His movements were deliberate, his silences full of meaning. Yet she couldn't bring herself to trust it. Men had shown her kindness before, but it always came with claws hidden behind smiles. She wanted to believe this one was different, but survival had taught her to doubt tenderness that came too freely. One evening, after the sun had set behind the hills, the rancher stayed to fix the door latch. The little girl had fallen asleep curled beside her grandmother, leaving the two of them in the amber light of a lantern. The widow spoke at last. "You don't owe us this." He paused, the hammer in his hand, motionless. "Maybe I don't," he said. "But maybe I want to." His voice wasn't soft, but it wasn't hard either. It carried a kind of truth that didn't need convincing. She wanted to ask him why, but his eyes, tired, distant, but kind, made her forget the question. After that night, something began to shift. He started coming not just with supplies, but with stories, quiet ones from a life that had grown too silent. He told her about his ranch beyond the ridge, miles of dry grass and stubborn cattle, land he kept alive with his own hands. He mentioned, without meaning to, a grave behind the barn. His wife, gone in childbirth years ago. Since then he had learned to speak less, work more, and expect nothing from the world. The widow listened, her heart tightening with a pain that was both his and hers. Loss recognized loss. It was a language they both understood. Her mother began to recover, slow but steady. The fever left her bones, replaced by weakness and the gentle complaints of the living. Sometimes she would smile faintly when she saw the rancher walk in. "Some men," she whispered once, "carry storms until someone reminds them they were meant to carry shade." The widow didn't reply. But that night, when she lay awake listening to the soft breathing of her daughter and mother, she thought of his hands, scarred, calloused, steady. Hands that built fences and graves alike. She didn't know why it mattered, but it did. As days passed, the town began to talk louder. Whispers about a giant rancher wasting his time on a widow no man would claim. He heard them. He ignored them. But when one of the shopkeepers made a crude remark within the widow's hearing, the rancher's restraint cracked. He didn't strike the man. He didn't need to. His stare was enough, a cold, heavy silence that made the shopkeeper step back and swallow his words. That night, the widow found him outside the stable, sitting on a wooden crate under the stars. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly. "I don't take kindly to mockery," he answered. "They'll only talk more now. Let them. I've been a story in their mouths for years." She didn't know how to reply. The firelight caught the edge of his jaw, rough and tired. For a long moment, the night said what they could not. The girl stirred in her sleep, and somewhere a coyote howled, lonely and wild. He looked toward the sound. "You shouldn't stay here much longer. The roof's near gone, and this town's got nothing left to offer." "Where would we go?" He hesitated before answering. "There's space at my ranch. A spare cabin. Safer there." Her instinct was to refuse. Pride and fear rose in equal measure. But when she looked at her mother, frail and coughing, and at the little girl whose feet were blistered from walking barefoot, her answer came quieter than she meant it to. "Only until she's well." He nodded. "Only until then." They left at dawn. The girl rode with him on his horse, her small hands gripping the saddle horn, laughter bursting like sunlight through clouds. The widow followed in the wagon, her mother wrapped in blankets. The trail wound between hills painted in early gold. The journey was silent but not heavy. Every mile put more distance between them and the town's cruelty. When they crested the final ridge, the ranch spread below like an ocean of grass, miles of open sky, a house standing proud in the middle, fences stretching into eternity. The rancher dismounted and turned to the widow. "It's not much," he said, "but it's honest." She looked over the land, her eyes wide with something close to wonder. "It's more than we've had in a long time." He didn't smile, but the quiet in him softened. The girl reached for his hand again, and he let her. By evening, the cabin was lit with the glow of a small fire. The old woman rested on a cot near the window, her breathing slow but calm. The widow stirred a pot over the flame, her movements graceful even in exhaustion. The rancher sat outside, the girl asleep beside him, her head against his arm. The stars hung low, close enough to touch. He listened to the quiet, to the sounds of life filling the house again, the creak of floorboards, the low murmur of voices, the soft clatter of hope returning. He thought he'd forgotten what it felt like to belong to something that wasn't land or labor, to hear laughter instead of wind, To feel the weight of another person's trust resting gently, not as a burden, but as a gift. Inside, the widow looked out through the doorway and saw him sitting there, still as a statue, eyes fixed on the horizon. And for the first time since her husband's death, she smiled without fear. The rancher didn't see it, but somehow he felt it, like the faint warmth of a hearth he hadn't realized was still burning. Rain came one night without warning, a quiet storm that softened the land and washed the dust from the porch. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of wood smoke and stew. The little girl slept curled near the hearth, her doll tucked beneath her chin. The widow sat beside her mother's bed, listening to the rain against the roof. The old woman's breathing was easier now, her fever gone, though her body still trembled from weakness. Outside, the rancher worked in the rain, fixing a loose gate before the wind could tear it free. Through the small window, she watched him, a dark shape against the silver light, each movement deliberate, steady, without complaint. She didn't understand why he kept helping. No man gave so much for so little. When he came in, dripping and quiet, she offered him a towel and a bowl of stew. He took both with a nod, sitting near the fire without asking for permission. They ate in silence for a long while, the crackle of the flames filling the space between them. When the bowl was empty, he said, "Your mother's strong. She'll see another spring." The widow looked up from her hands. "You sound certain." "I've seen folks give up for less," he said. "But I've also seen those who don't. She's the second kind." There was a pause, and then softly, "You're the third kind, I think." He didn't answer. Instead, he stared into the fire, the light carving lines of weariness across his face. She wanted to ask about the grave behind his barn, the one he'd mentioned only once, but she didn't. Some silences deserved to stay untouched. Days slipped into weeks. The ranch came alive again. The widow helped in the kitchen, the garden, and sometimes rode out with him to mend fences. The girl followed the ranch hands, calling them cowboys and pretending she could rope clouds. Laughter began to return to the land, small and hesitant at first, then steady as the seasons turned. But not everyone welcomed it. Word spread through nearby towns about the widow and her child living with a giant rancher. Some said he'd gone soft, others said she'd bewitched him. Men who once mocked her in the street now muttered her name with venom. One afternoon, as she walked back from the well, 3 of them rode up the hill. Faces she remembered. The same men who'd refused her cries for help in that first town, the ones who had laughed at her suffering. "Well, look who found herself a new home," one sneered. "Didn't take long, did it?" She said nothing, tightening her grip on the water bucket. "Guess a big man like him needs company," another added, spitting into the dust. "Maybe we should thank him for taking in a town stray." Before she could move, they pushed past her, knocking the bucket over. The cold water soaked her skirt, but she stood still, jaw clenched, eyes steady. They laughed and turned their horses toward the barn. The sound of the gate opening stopped them. The rancher stepped out, his sighs filling the world around him. No words passed between them for a moment. Only the soft hiss of the rain starting again, faint but steady. One of the men smirked. "We were just paying our respects, friend." The rancher took a slow step forward. His hands were calm, but his eyes had the stillness of a man who had seen too much cruelty to be afraid of it anymore. "You done?" he asked. They tried to hold their ground, but his silence pressed harder than any threat could. Finally, they turned their horses and rode off, their laughter fading into the distance. When they were gone, the widow whispered, "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," he said quietly, "I did." She wanted to thank him, but gratitude felt too small for what he'd just done. Instead, she picked up the bucket, refilled it, and carried it inside without another word. That night, when she set his dinner at the table, their eyes met for the first time without fear between them. Something unspoken crossed the space, trust, maybe, or something close to it. Later, when the girl showed him her drawing, 3 figures standing beneath a tree, the ranch house behind them, he asked who they were. She pointed, smiling. "That's Grandma. That's Mama. And that's you." He folded the drawing carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. "I'll keep it," he said. The girl beamed. The widow looked away, pretending to tidy the table, but her hands trembled slightly. She hadn't realized how much this man had already become part of their lives until that moment. Weeks passed, and the ranch settled into a rhythm of shared work and quiet evenings. Yet beneath the calm, something was shifting inside her. When she looked at him, she saw not the giant the town feared, but a man carrying his own ghosts, still finding the courage to be kind. She saw gentleness in the way he lifted her mother's chair to the porch every morning, patience in how he taught the girl to feed the horses, and grief in the way he sometimes stood alone at dusk, staring toward the horizon where the graves lay. One evening, when the sky burned orange, she walked out to him. "You still visit her," she said, her voice soft. He nodded. "Some things you don't stop talking to, even when they stop answering." "I understand," she said. "I know you do." The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was warm, filled with everything neither needed to say. He turned toward her then, eyes reflecting the sunset. "You and that girl, you brought noise back to this place." She smiled faintly. "I thought you liked quiet." "I did," he said, "until it started feeling like being dead with your eyes open." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain again. The girl's laughter echoed from the house, followed by her mother's soft call for her to wash before supper. He didn't move, only watched the widow walk back, her figure framed in the fading light. Something inside him, a heart long thought buried, stirred awake. That night, as thunder rolled across the plains, he dreamed for the first time in years. In the dream, the cabin was full of laughter, not ghosts. The rain fell gentle, not cruel. And when he woke before dawn, the quiet no longer felt lonely. But peace on the frontier was a fragile thing, always tested by envy and fear. From the ridge above the ranch, unseen in the darkness, the same men who had come before watched the house lights flicker. One of them spat and muttered, "Let's see how soft the giant really is." Inside, the widow lay awake, listening to the wind. She didn't know why her chest felt tight, why unease had crept into her bones again. Outside, the rancher saddled his horse under the pale light of the moon, scanning the horizon. He couldn't see them yet, but he could feel it, the change in the air, the kind that comes before a storm. He looked once toward the cabin, toward the faint glow of the fire inside, then whispered into the dark, "Not again." The rain began to fall harder, drumming against the earth like a warning. And somewhere beyond the hills, danger started to move closer, silent as smoke, bringing with it the reckoning that would test the quiet world they had built together. The storm passed with the first hint of dawn, leaving behind a sky so clear it felt almost holy. The ranch lay quiet under a pale gold light, fences glistening with dew, the air heavy with the smell of rain-soaked dust. Inside the main house, the fire burned low. The girl slept curled beside her mother, her small hand resting on the woman's chest, as if guarding her heartbeat. The giant rancher sat by the window, watching the world breathe again. He hadn't slept, not because of the rain, but because the silence afterward felt like a promise he didn't yet know how to keep. He thought about the words the little girl had said the night before, "They hurt my mom. She is sick." It echoed in him, not as a plea, but as truth. A truth about all the people the world forgot. When the woman awoke, her fever had broken. Her voice was soft, like someone remembering how to speak. She thanked him, not with grand words, but a look, one that reached deep into the man's chest and stirred something quiet but strong. He didn't ask for her story. He just handed her a bowl of broth and said she could stay as long as she needed. Days passed in a rhythm the ranch hadn't known in years. The girl's laughter began to fill the barn, the kitchen, even the porch where the old dog used to sleep. The rancher started to fix things that had long been left undone. The crooked fence by the east field, the cracked saddle strap, the windmill that had stopped turning last summer. He told himself he was doing it for the land, but deep down he knew he was rebuilding something inside himself too. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the cottonwoods, the woman joined him outside. Her hair was tied back, her face still pale but calm. She looked out over the fields where the horses grazed and said softly, "You live like the land, wide, quiet, and too alone." He smiled a little, a rare sight. "Alone's easier." The land don't talk back. She studied him for a long moment. Maybe it should. Maybe it's been waiting for someone to listen. Something about her words sank deep into him, deeper than he wanted to admit. He had spent his whole life building fences, thinking they were for cattle, but maybe they were for himself. Later that week, 2 riders came from town, men who looked like they carried trouble in their saddlebags. They asked for the woman by name, said her husband wanted her back, that she'd run off with money that wasn't hers. The rancher stood on the porch, silent as a mountain, while the woman's face went pale. The girl clung to her leg. He didn't ask if the story was true. He looked into her eyes, and that was enough. There was no deceit there, only fear, the kind that comes from a long time being hurt. The men tried to step forward. The rancher shifted, his shadow stretching across the porch boards like a drawn curtain. His voice came low, steady. You can tell whoever sent you that she's under my roof now. And if he wants her back, he can come and see me himself. The men hesitated, sensing something in him that wasn't just size, but conviction. They turned without another word. The rancher watched them go until their dust vanished into the horizon. That night, the woman wept quietly by the fire. Not from fear, but from the way someone had stood up for her without asking her to earn it. He didn't touch her, didn't speak, just sat close enough for her to feel she wasn't alone. In the weeks that followed, word spread through the valley about what had happened, how the giant rancher had stood his ground for a woman and her child. Some said he'd gone soft. Others said he'd finally found something worth fighting for. He didn't care which was true. He only knew that when the girl smiled, the house didn't feel so big anymore. As spring rolled into summer, the woman began helping around the ranch, mending clothes, feeding the hands, tending to the garden that had long gone to weeds. Her laughter came easier now, like a melody the walls had been waiting to hear. One night, under a sky heavy with stars, the rancher walked her to the barn where the horses slept. She stopped at the door, looking up at the endless stretch of light. Do you ever think about leaving all this? She asked. He shook his head. Used to think the world was out there somewhere. Turns out, it's right here. Just took me a while to see it. She looked at him, really looked, and in that silence something shifted, not like a storm, but like the earth quietly deciding to grow again after winter. By the end of summer, the girl called the rancher Sir Less and Pa More. It happened one morning at breakfast, casual, unplanned, but it hit him like sunrise breaking through fog. The woman froze, her eyes meeting his, unsure whether to apologize or smile. He just nodded once, a tear caught in his beard, and said softly, "Pass the bread, sweetheart." Life on the ranch carried on. The seasons turned, storms came and went, but something unspoken held them together. Not obligation, not need, but a kind of love that grew in the quiet, between moments, like grass through stone. Years later, folks would still tell the story of the giant rancher and the woman who'd arrived half dead in a rainstorm, her daughter clutching her side. Some said he saved them. Others said they saved him. But those who truly knew the land, who had seen the way a heart can learn to trust again, whispered a different truth, that sometimes the greatest strength isn't in how hard a man can stand, but how gently he can stay. And if you ever ride through that valley at dusk, you might still see them, a tall man by the fence line, a woman hanging laundry in the wind, and a girl chasing sunlight across the fields. Stories like that don't end. They settle into the earth, like roots finding home. Like, share, and subscribe for more tales whispered from the heart of the frontier. This was Frontier Myths. Hit the bell icon, and let the next story find you.